And a common 21st century objection would be that Jesus never actually claimed to be God. He was just a great religious teacher like Buddha and Confucius. And that was the natural layer. And then all of a sudden, the people who wrote the Gospels, the people who wrote the New Testament, introduced this supernatural layer, this divinized layer where Jesus could perform miracles, rose from the dead, and claimed he was God. Well, in order for that third layer to happen, or that second layer to happen, the supernatural Jesus, you would have to have 3 generations to pass in order for that to become realized. Otherwise, you would have eyewitnesses who could reject that, who could say, no, he never actually claimed to be God. So the dating of the Gospels is absolutely crucial for the survival of Christianity. So what do the biblical scholars say? What does the timeline look like? Well, if you look up here, most biblical scholars would put the crucifixion in AD 30. And then it would put the New Testament between AD 50 and AD 100. So that's 20 to 70 years after Jesus' ministry, which is well within living memory of Jesus' ministry. And there's good evidence to believe that the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony. But couldn't the authors have messed something up? Couldn't there have been something lost in translation between the year 30 and the year 50 when things started getting written down? Well, it depends what kind of information you're talking about. Because if you're talking about a big detail, like Jesus claiming to be God, this was something so central to Jesus' identity that couldn't have been made up within 20 years. But suppose the apostles did create a lie. Suppose they did make up that Jesus claimed to be God. Why would they do it? Why would they do it? Liars always get something out of a lie. What do the apostles get? Many of them got tortured. Many of them got burned at the stake. Many of them got crucified. Why would they go around and start saying that Jesus is God to everybody? The eyewitnesses who knew Jesus. So we can conclude that Jesus, the first century Nazarene, did claim to be God. So that has huge implications on who Jesus is. So most people would say Jesus is trustworthy. Now Jesus claimed a certain identity, and many people would think he's good. But if he was wrong about his identity, if he was wrong about believing he was God and he wasn't God, he would be a bad man. He would be a bad man. Because he couldn't be called good, he couldn't be called trustworthy. He would be bad. He would be either intellectually bad or morally bad. Now, there are a bunch of people in asylums who claim to be a number of things, from Elvis to Napoleon to God. But what makes Jesus any different? Well, Jesus is different because his sayings and his characters was totally different. You wouldn't say he was insane. His sayings, love your enemies, love your neighbor as yourself, turn the other cheek. Those sayings surely don't sound like some insane person. Also, his character was great. While on the cross, he was dying. He was in extreme pain. He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He was asking for the forgiveness of the people who were crucifying him, who were killing him. His enemies could not find any fault in him, and his friends said, this man has no sin. So Jesus surely doesn't sound like an insane man. But if Jesus knew he was deceiving others, if he knew that he was claiming to be God but he wasn't God, he would be a liar. If I claim to be God, you'd think I was crazy, or you'd think I was morally bad. Perhaps like this man, Jesus Miranda. Jesus Miranda founded a church in the Florida area, Miami, Florida. And he uses this eloquent speech and this interpretation of Scripture. And he finally makes a claim that he is Jesus Christ back again. Now, I think he knows that he isn't actually Jesus Christ. How do I know? Well, his ministry has given him a lot of money, and he has expensive cars and this big house and nice suits and everything. So he has a motive for claiming to be Jesus, because people follow him. But what makes Jesus different? Well, Jesus, you'll notice in the Gospels, doesn't make the claim right up front. He lets people get to know him first. He lets people know that he is not an egocentric, blasphemous liar. Liars always lie for egocentric purposes. They always get something out of the lie. What did Jesus get? Torture and crucifixion. It's hardly a perk. So if Jesus is not a liar, and he's not insane, then he must be who he claims to be, God. And incidentally, he proved that he was credible through his resurrection. The resurrection actually has more evidence than many historical events from that era of time. In fact, a lot of people might say, okay, you can't prove that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, sure, we can't prove that Jesus rose from the dead, but what we can do is we don't have any video cameras to go back in time and show that Jesus rose from the dead and walked out of the tomb. But what we can do is show that there's two pieces of evidence that show that the only logical explanation is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. One is the empty tomb, and two is the appearances of Jesus to his disciples. And also, on top of that, the Jewish authorities could not strike down the resurrection. They couldn't reject it because they would have had to come up with evidence to say that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. But let's take a look at the alternatives at the resurrection. First, if the early Christians were proclaiming Jesus is risen from the dead, and he goes out, and they all go out and they start preaching that Jesus rose from the dead, and then he didn't rise from the dead, there's two possibilities. They're either deceivers, they're either deceiving the masses, or they were deceived themselves. Alright, well, let's take a look at the first alternative. Were they deceiving the masses? Well, what happens is there's these disciples, they're saying that Jesus rose from the dead, and they're telling the people who had just crucified Jesus. Why would they go do that? Why would they tell these people? And then also, you have a body in the tomb, so all the Jewish authorities would have to do is show them that Jesus has not risen from the dead. But what about the disciples? Could they have stolen the body out of the tomb? Well, why would the disciples steal a body from the tomb and all of a sudden just start proclaiming that Jesus has risen from the dead? 11 out of the 12 apostles, as we know from history, ended up being martyred for their faith. Why would they go to the length to dying for their faith just for a lie? So what's the other possibility? The disciples were hallucinating. Okay, let's think about that. As we see in the accounts of the Gospels, we see that Jesus appears to the disciples in a massive group. Usually hallucinations only appear to one person, but Jesus appeared in a massive group. In this alleged hallucination, ate food, people touched him, and a wide variety of other things that typically you can't do with hallucination. So, also, if you have the hallucination, if Jesus is just appearing to these disciples and they go around proclaiming that Jesus has risen from the dead, you get to the point where the Jewish authorities could say, no, he hasn't risen from the dead. They go to the tomb, Jesus is still in there. So we've shown that the resurrection is the only explanation for the two pieces of evidence. The empty tomb and the appearances to Jesus' disciples. In that, the resurrection was what caused the apostolic fervor. It's what caused the eyewitnesses to go out and die for their faith. So, Jesus is God. What does that have to do with my life? Well, if Jesus is God, a lot of people see Christianity as do good to go to heaven and do bad to go to hell. But in reality, Christianity is about a relationship with God. It's about a relationship. What's it about?
Relationship.
Relationship. I said relationship. What's it about?
Relationship.
Yeah, relationship. In fact, the very word religion comes from the Latin word religare, which means relationship. Relationship with who? Relationship with God. Relationship with Christ. So, if you think of it this way, that Jesus teaches us to love God above all things. That's the first commandment that he says. And then he says you'll remain in this love by following the commandments. But you have to think about it this way. Jesus teaches us to call God our Father. And so, with any relationship with any parent, your relationship increases, it strengthens when you listen to your parent. And it weakens when you don't listen to your parent. And you can get to the point where you weaken it to where there's no relationship anymore. You can completely cut yourself off. That's your choice. Heaven is this intimate relationship with God. And Jesus wants us all to have that relationship with him. But it's up to us to say yes. It's up to us to make that happen. In addition to listening to God, in terms of obedience, we also have to communicate with God. Just as in any relationship. In any relationship, you need to have communication in order to strengthen the relationship. With God, it's no different. And of course, that would be through prayer. Now, prayer isn't just going to God and saying, God, I want these things, I want this and this and this. No. Prayer is also listening to God, listening to the voice of God, and trying to hear what he wants to happen in your life. Now, we all have big questions. We all have big questions. What should my major be? Should I date this person? What job should I have in the future? Should I have Lucky Charms or tricks? Of course, that's a ridiculous question. The answer is Lucky Charms because, silly Preston, tricks are for kids. But we all have these big questions in life, and we just need someone to ask. God is all-powerful. God is all-knowing. He's the one who has the answers.